booktube and all Repairman Jack fans. My name is Nathan. Thank you so much for watching and welcome to my channel. This is my longer discussion video for Fatal Error, which is book number 15 in the Repairman Jack series. Fatal Error was first published in 2010. The reason why I'm hesitating with calling it book number 15 is because I really don't know what to do with The Last Christmas. The Last Christmas, if you watch my discussion video, it's updates the timeline into the contemporary world, but everything else in the series is supposed to take place within a span of 3 years. That you have Night World being year 0, and then Wilson just backtracks in the timeline year 0, -1, -2, -3, which brings us to the tomb. So all of the other references were from like 2000 to 2003, somewhere around there. And then we have The Last Christmas that really operates as a standalone, so I don't know what to do with it, because it does fit into the chronology of the series, albeit an updated chronology. Anyway, Ground Zero maybe comes before Fatal Error, or The Last Christmas does, but no matter what, The Dark at the End comes after, which was published in 2011. Now, if you're new to this, then I'm reading through all of the books in the series, all of the books in the Repairman Jack series by F. Paul Wilson. I do 2 videos a week. I do a short spoiler-free review video and then a longer discussion video. So this is the longer one for Fatal Error. Now, the reading order, and I guess I might as well just begin with it because it is puzzling, and that was part of my challenge in doing this series. The challenge in taking on a reading project, like reading through all of the Repairman Jack books, and then I plan on getting to the Adversary Cycle as well, is kind of curiosity, and I'm partially documenting what happens when a person, me in particular, reads through all of the books in the Repairman Jack series in fairly short order. Because when I first read them, I read them over, honestly, it was probably close to 10 years, because it took him quite a while to publish all of the different books. So from the time that I first read a Repairman Jack book until I read Night World, there is a big gap there. So I'm trying to see what happens when you do read them in publication order, but then I did go out of order with The Last Christmas to fit with the chronology of the series. But I've also just kind of in my head said, I'll just read the Repairman Jack books, but I won't try to bounce between them and the Adversary Cycle. But I think that probably would be better. Not to make the series even more daunting for new readers, if you are a new reader to the series and you're kind of considering getting into it, or if you're thinking about recommending this to a friend, it's kind of hard to say to a friend, yeah, you would love this Repairman Jack series, but you're going to have to be ready to read like 28 books. Because that's so intimidating, especially if somebody doesn't know if they're going to like it. And if you say, and the big story arc doesn't really get going until book 3 with conspiracies, and then it kind of disappears for a little bit, and then it comes back with the Cosmic Shadow War and everything leading to Night World, and then it's like, and you also have to read the Adversary Cycle at the same time, and it would also be useful to read the young adult series when you get later on in the Repairman Jack series. Like, that's intimidating for a lot of people. I think by reading through this, though, I've been able to make some good recommendations. I've made some recommendations of books that I think you can read as a standalone, books that are a really good introduction to the series for new readers, to kind of get a sense of whether you would enjoy the series or not. But with Fatal Error, as much as it is a Repairman Jack book, it's also really a prelude to Night World, and you can see that Wilson is orchestrating all of the events, that he's basically moving chess pieces, right, metaphorically. Then he's taking all these characters and storylines and moving them in certain ways to position everything towards Night World. That this is not a standard Repairman Jack book, as much as it maybe starts that way, because Jack starts out and he's helping Munir Habib, I apologize. He's helping him with, Munir's wife has been kidnapped, and Munir, you know, doesn't go to the police because the kidnapper says don't go to the police, and he just assumes, because of what the kidnapper has said, the reason why this man has kidnapped my wife and child is because I'm Arab and he lost his sister during the September 11th attacks, and he's angry for that reason, and he's taking it out on me and on my family. That's what Munir believes. But as you read through the book, you realize, oh no, that's not what's actually going on here. This guy has been hired by, I think it's by the Septimus Order, because the kickers are involved as well, but I think he's a Septimus Order guy. He's hired to basically create a ruse with the kidnapping in order to get Munir to do whatever he wants. And Munir is a computer programmer who has developed new code for an MMO, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, that he's created a new code for this that allows video to transfer faster between users. And they plan on using this, the Septimus Order, with the help of the kickers and with the help of the Dormentalists and all of this, and Rasalom is behind all of that. The plan is to bring down the internet itself. And the reason why they want to do this is because if you bring down the internet, you are then going to be able to, that will essentially weaken the news sphere so much that the lady, who's already in a weakened state as a result of the Finchmonka, which we saw a couple books ago with Ground Zero, and Daryl attacking her as the Finchmonka, that she has a second death there. As a result of that, she's incredibly weak. And if she disappears out of existence, the ally will then believe that Earth is no longer a sentient planet, that it no longer has sentient beings on the planet, so it will basically abandon Earth. The otherness can then take over. Rasalom can, rule Earth in this otherness nightmare world, right? That's basically what's happening. So that fix that Jack gets involved in, it maybe seems like an ordinary Jack fix. Okay, help this guy whose family has been kidnapped. Kidnappings are not really his thing, but fine, he can do this. But it's like, no, even that was all about the Septimus Order, kickers, Dormentalists, Rasalom, the, cosmic war that's going on. It's going to lead up to Night World. It's going to take out the internet and the news sphere, which will then kill the lady, is the plan. All of that stuff is happening. And so we know that as we read, and this Munir storyline basically gets resolved halfway through the book. And then the second half of the book is very much a prelude to Night World, where it's really not much of a Jack book anymore, and it almost feels, and I'm not saying this in a critical way, but I feel like Wilson just got himself into such a difficult position with Fatal Error, where he already had Night World written, although he was revising it, I'm sure, probably at the same time as working on Fatal Error, that he already had written Night World like 2 decades prior to this. He already knew where it was going to be. He already knew the characters, he knew what was going to happen, and so now he's trying to align those timelines to coincide and to get characters into places that they need to be. And as part of that, Jack ends up not really being able to do anything for like the last 200 pages of the book. There's really very little action, and the action that we do have feels contrived. It feels like Wilson is trying to come up with some way to create a climax, or there really can't be a climax at the end of this. That, yes, the Septimus Order and the kickers are able to, bring down the internet, at least for a period of time. The lady seems like she's not going to survive, although she miraculously does. As you find out towards the end of the book, that the reason why is because she's not being fed by the news sphere anymore. She's become a person, not a human, but a person, and because of attachments that she has to people like Lycan and Jack and Wheezy, presumably other people as well, right? But because of that, she's now can kind of exist outside of the news sphere, even though she's an avatar of the news sphere. Okay, I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense. I'm just saying that's basically where we're at. We don't get much more of an explanation beyond that. And so so you have that happening, but that's not like a typical climax that we get with Repairman Jack novels. Because what we typically have is everything leads to something, and then Jack is able to, often by being fairly violent and action, you know, he's able to, you know, take care of things and resolve whatever situation it is that he's trying to resolve. Not only do we not get a resolution here, but the only thing that Jack's doing for the last 200 pages is basically being impatient with the lady, Glaken, Wheezy, while Glaken continues to say, Jack, you can't do anything. I don't want Rasalom to know that I'm mortal, that I'm elderly, that I have no power. I don't want him to know any of that stuff, so you're not allowed to do anything. Gia and Vicky, and there's a reason why I'm bringing this up. Gia brings Vicky to Iowa to go and visit her family. Jack is worried about them. This is in the last, like, this is taking place over the entire book, that they leave fairly early in the story. But they're in Iowa. Jack is like, oh no, Night World's getting closer. The internet's going to go down. Who knows what could happen? I want you guys back home. So he really strongly advises for Gia to bring her and Vicky back home. So they fly back. Their flight arrives, but the flight is traveling just as the internet really goes down. And Jack then has to figure out a way to get across the city to go and meet them at the airport, even though he won't be able to bring them back because the subways are all shut down. Traffic is like there's so much congestion that nobody's even moving, right? And that's the action that we get. The action that we get is Julio's brother brings Jack a motorcycle, and then a couple guys try to steal the motorcycle from Jack, and then a couple guys are harassing Gia in the airport that they're, I mean, you know, like just sexually harassing her in the airport, and that's the action that we get. Jack then, you know, killing these guys, you know, going with them down into the basement of the airport, down a stairwell, and then killing them. But it's not like anything is moving against Rasalom in terms of Jack. At the very end of the book, you have that Glaken's like, hey, now you're free to go after Rasalom. And the reason why is because Rasalom discovers that Glaken is elderly, that he's mortal. So there's no more point in pretending that that's not what's happening, because while we have the events of Fatal Error, Reprisal is going on simultaneously. And I said this in my short spoiler-free review video for Fatal Error. I have not read Reprisal before, and it feels like you should actually read these books not even in quick succession. It feels like you should be reading them simultaneously. I don't know either book well enough to know the best way of doing it. But presumably, you know, you would read up to a certain page in Fatal Error, then read up to a certain page in Reprisal, and then kind of switch back and forth between the two of them, because they are taking place simultaneously. And it kind of seems like Reprisal would be the more interesting storyline at this point in the entire Adversary Secret History of the World story arc that Wilson has going at this point. And to make things just a touch more complicated, which don't blame me because I didn't complicate them, but to make them just a touch more complicated, Secret Circles, the young adult book, came out the same year as Fatal Error, and there's a lot of references to Secret Circles, or sorry, to Secret Circles while you're reading Fatal Error. So so what I'm saying is, you read Fatal Error, but you also should be reading Reprisal. You should also be reading Secret Circles at the same time. I don't even know if you should read The Last Christmas just before you read Fatal Error, but I do know no matter what, you definitely need to read The Dark at the End after all of this, and then read the revised edition of Night World. I know that, but I would say this, with Fatal Error, this has got to be the most confusing point in the series from a reader's perspective in terms of, what do I even do? Which books do I even read at this point? So That's been my experience. I've got a few notes in here that I wanted to bring up. This is a longer point, like a broader discussion, but I brought it up a lot in the discussion video for The Last Christmas. And what I said with The Last Christmas is that even though we have the original chronology of the series, as far as, maybe chronology is not the right word, our timeline is essentially a 3-year timeline, or a 3-year chronology, where you have Nightworld being the end, and that is year 0, and then you just backtrack from there. But if you backtrack from there, the Tomb is like 3 years before Nightworld. So if you read the Tomb, or any of the books in the Repairman Jack series up to Ground Zero, they all are taking place in like 2000, 2001, 2002, and then I guess, I don't know if we have anything that's really taking place in 2003. Fatal Error should be taking place in 2003. The Last Christmas, this should be December 2002, but it's not. It's like December 2015, maybe? I don't know. It's not clear. As far as I can tell, the most updated references we have would be things like Obamacare, Uber, Lyft, things like that in The Last Christmas. So we're clearly in a post-Obamacare world, and also Uber and Lyft continue to exist. So I would say at least, like, my best guess is 2015. I don't know. It could be even later than that. It could be that in his mind it was like 2019. And it was very jarring as a reader to be going through it. If you go from Ground Zero into The Last Christmas, you're going, we just jumped, what, 13 years, 17 years into the future? And then I thought that Fatal Error was 2003. But I was reading Fatal Error and I realized that he updated the timeline here too. And I don't know why. Because this is like taking place in 2009. It's so confusing, and I've brought it up before that it doesn't make sense in the timeline that you have Rasalom using the Septimus Order to orchestrate the attack to influence Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, to attack the World Trade Center, to knock the buildings down, to then be able to access the first pillar from Operation Opus Omega, which can then be used to create a Finch Monka, which they do with Daryl, which will then destroy the lady. And the reason why they do this is because Rasalom believes that Operation Opus Omega very likely will not work, or if it will take far too long to ever accomplish it. So he wants to speed it up. So he orchestrates September 11th, essentially, to get at that pillar. So where did the urgency go then if he does that in 2001, in September of 2001, but now we're talking about 2009 or 2019? 2015? I'm so baffled by this, and I'm honestly a little bit frustrated because I thought that The Last Christmas was the outlier, and I didn't understand. I just thought, why didn't he just write it in December 2002? Why didn't he just set it there? And that the entire Jack storyline is just an alternate history. It's an alternate reality or timeline of what could have happened on Earth. But I thought that was the outlier. But now that I'm reading Fatal Error, I'm realizing, oh, well, he updated it with Fatal Error. So I'm assuming Fatal Error, The Dark at the End, Nightworld are all taking place in what, like 2009, 2010? And then this one's taking place in like 2015. But the other ones, as they're written, because you have to read them as they're written, he hasn't revised. The other, like, 14 books in the series are all written as though they're happening in like 2000, 2001, 2002. But he insists that it's a 3-year timeline. That it's not like there's the Tomb and then 20 years later, Jack is going after the Wolfman in The Last Christmas, and then we go back 10 years and Nightworld happens. So as if it was not already confusing enough, the timeline is, in terms of when these books are set, makes it even more confusing. Again, and I brought it up with The Last Christmas. I said, just because it's not perfect, and you can find continuity errors in the series, and you can find other errors as well, a book series, or even a standalone book, does not have to be flawless to be enjoyable, does not have to be flawless to be your favorite book, right? I'm not looking for perfection, and I still really, really love the series, but boy, does that get confusing, and it is kind of frustrating as a reader, and I wish that just the entire series was just either set in some... that he wasn't using such specific references ever, that we didn't get references to things like specific, apps like Uber and Lyft, or, something like Twitter or Facebook. Like, just don't make those kind of references at all. That maybe would have been helpful. Or just stick with the original timeline of like 2000 to 2003, and then it doesn't matter when people read it. They just understand it's alternate history. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I don't really get it. But it's okay. It's okay that I don't enjoy that. And even though I feel like there's such an obvious solution to this, it's okay that he didn't solve it in that way. All right. So some smaller notes that I have. You get this really, like Dawn Pickering, I have not mentioned this yet. She does have the baby, and her and Wheezy, they end up connecting, and Dawn is convinced that her baby is not actually dead, but that's what they tell her, because this is, of course, the baby that is loaded with O DNA, and it's not really a human. And you get this great description of it on page 114. So she looks at her baby, and it's got, actually this is the bottom of 113. He had hair, a full head of black hair, and dark down covering his skin. But what were those things under his arms? Snakes. 2 baby snakes, maybe 4 inches long, had sunk their fangs into his armpits and were writhing. No, tendrils, that's what they were. No, tentacles, 2 smooth, twisting, coiling tentacles. No, suckers like an octopus, flesh-colored, looked like rat tails. Dawn screamed again as Dr. Landsman rushed away with her baby. Her little boy's eyes opened, and he looked at her with a black gaze. As she screamed again, she saw the anesthetist injecting something into her IV line. So, I wanted to mark that because it's such a great, creepy description of this kicker baby, right? The QQR, right? The cooker. I think that... Cooker? I think that's how you're supposed to pronounce it, because we did get an explanation in one of the books. That basically the kicker man tattoos, is now flesh again. That the kicker race that's kind of been extinct, but humans have had a little trace amounts of their DNA all along, is now, born in the flesh again. And it's a really interesting description. I think it's a little bit undone, maybe not, but a little bit undone, the significance of, oh man, there's a kicker person, a kicker species on Earth again, because apparently, and I have not read Secret Circles, but because of the references in Fatal Error, apparently the last kicker person was alive in the Pine Barrens when Jack was a kid, or in the basement of the Septimus Order, in the lodge, that you get references. Like I say, I haven't read this yet. I will read it fairly soon. But I don't know. I feel like it would have been better if we haven't had kickers on Earth for thousands of years, not since the First Age, and then Dawn's baby is the first one, instead of, oh yeah, there's been one who's been around, so it's only been like 20-something years since we saw one of these things. That's just my thought, but I don't know. Maybe it's fine. All right. Moving on. There's a really, and this stood out in the book, there's a really interesting consideration about the lingering effects of violence. So this is after Jack has saved, I think her name is Barbara? Yeah, Barbara and Robbie. That's Munir Habib's wife and son. Jack is able to rescue them, but Jack is seeing how Barbara kind of resents Munir, even though it's not his fault, but just how do you get over trauma like that? And he just looks at this and he's like, Jack can basically see it coming that if the relationship does survive, it's going to be incredibly damaged, perhaps permanently so. Maybe they'll never really come back from this, and that the resentment is going to be there between Barbara and Munir, and maybe Robbie's going to feel the same way because Robbie loses a finger, and that he's going to blame his dad for this because of his dad's work, and that's why he was kidnapped, and that's why the kidnapper did that to him, and all of that. I mean, it's like I say, it's an interesting commentary about the lingering effects of violence, and I'm not saying that it's almost as though it's Jack has the attitude that it's just, this is a given, that anybody who survives this kind of ordeal will ultimately become bitter and resentful and blame their partner, even though it wasn't really their partner's fault, but kind of this peripheral involvement. And I'm sure that happens, and I'm sure that happens often, but I think that that's not a given, and I think there's plenty of people who have survived awful things in the past and they get over it, and relationships do survive even when something like that happens. But it's an interesting commentary that Wilson is making there, and it's through Jack's eyes, that Jack is kind of interpreting how Barbara is reacting, and he's just seeing all these warning signs for the relationship and for how Robbie will probably feel about his dad in the future. Another, and this is just a small thing, so Russ Tweet, Jack's IT guy, essentially, he unfortunately is killed in this book because of his involvement with, basically the Septimus Order has hired him to come up with some way to get past all of these different defenses in order to bring down the internet, because that's of course all part of the plan to take out the lady with destroying the news sphere. There's also this discussion between Rasalom and Ernst Drexler, who's one of the higher ups with the Septimus Order. There's this discussion on page 158, and I've got the mass market paperback edition of the book, so it's page 158 of my edition, where they're talking about the lady, and they're saying that their lore says, I think this is Drexler who's saying, yeah, it's Drexler. So Rasalom asks him, he says, okay, so like, we'll bring down the internet and that will extinguish the lady. This is Drexler. The lore says she must be slain 3 times. The first death was accomplished by another hand. The one's eyes gleamed. Yes, that upstart mutant in Florida unknowingly aided us, which is from Gateways. She might have proven to be an asset, but she was impossible to control. Ernst knew little of this, had gleaned only bits from passing references to the incident. Now was not the time to ask for more. I understand those circumstances were unique. Since they were not reproducible, we turned to the Finch Manca. Yes, but that failed. And then it's like, it didn't fail, blah, blah, blah. But no, now we've got this third time that we have to kill her 3 times. That's what the lore says. Okay, folks, you can correct me, but I think that just that would be like retroactive continuity, right? Like Wilson just retconned that was not true before. This is the first time we're hearing of the lore that says that the lady must be slain 3 times. For one thing, she doesn't know it. She said that she should not have come back after the Florida incident, but she did. She said that she should not have been able to come back after the Finch Manca destroyed her, but she did, and it's because the news sphere is much more powerful than she thought. But she does make it very clear after that happens, while she is weak, while she is recovering, which she expects will take approximately a year, if she is killed one more time, then it will really be over. But there was nothing about this idea of you have to kill her once, and then you have to kill her twice, and then that third time she'll actually stay dead. That's just a new invention as far as I can see, and I feel like it was unnecessary. It's because we didn't get references to it before, and maybe if Wilson ever revised the series, that would be something that he could work into some of the earlier books, because it's a little odd that it just kind of stands out. All of a sudden, then we start hearing about this, and like Rasalom is like, "Ooh, is the lore correct?" It's like, dude, weren't you there when the lore was all written? That wouldn't you know? Why are you asking Drexler if this stuff is true? Like, you were there in the First Age. All right. Like I say, you do have references to the timeline shifting, that this is much more contemporary, because I believe it says, I think it's here, page 169, that Munir's son Robbie, who's, I forget how old, but that he wasn't even born when September 11th happened. That's where I really caught the fact. There's some other updated references, but that's where it becomes obvious that it's like, oh, this has got to be somewhere around 2009. There's lots and lots of references to the Adversary Cycle, a lot of backstory there, a lot of meetings. Like, you get multiple meetings with the lady, Glaken, Jack, Wheezy, all sitting around in the lady's condo, which is in Glaken's building that he owns. And a lot of, so this is what's happening, and this is the whole backstory to it, and this is where we're at in the process, and this is what Rasalom must be planning in order to destroy the lady, you know, that the plan is to take down the internet, the news sphere, all of that. And anyway, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of sitting around saying, this is what the other side is doing, but there's not a lot of action, and Jack is going crazy from this. But it feels, like I say, at times it feels like the violence that we do get, the action that we do get in the second half of the book is a little bit contrived. And the second half of the book, Reprisal seems like, you know, really where it's at. And Fatal Error, it's like everybody's kind of stalling, and it's like there's not a lot happening because Rasalom is not really here for Fatal Error. He's in, is it North Carolina or South Carolina? One or the other. And then Rasalom, and then Glaken goes down there as well. And you have references to other people who are doing things down there, including Rasalom's mother is going with Glaken. That Glaken digs up something in the cemetery where Emma is buried, in order to use that against Rasalom, but then things don't go well at the end of Reprisal, and that's where you get to the end of Fatal Error, and then Glaken's like, yeah, he found me out, things didn't go the way I thought, so we're kind of in trouble, and Jack, you're free to go after him any way you can. And it definitely feels like, essentially, the last 200 pages of the book feel like a great big cleansing breath before we get into the, you know, essentially the climax. Because I think you could say that the Dark at the end and then Night World together can be considered the climax. But we're certainly getting there. But basically it's this big breath that you have of, there's this big pause, and it's like, everything's happening in Reprisal, and then it's like, yeah, that didn't go well, the internet's now down. Now, Jack, now you can go after him. That's how the last 200 pages feel. And it's interesting because it, as far as pacing, it's not a typical Repairman Jack book with the pacing because of that. Because it doesn't end with this climax. And it's not like the other ones that we've had where Wilson has, you know, described basically from Harbingers forward the books as a roman fleuve, which is just a river novel, the French for river novel, where one blends into the other. But he still kind of had Jack storylines that were moving. The only Jack storyline that we have in the last 200 pages is, Gia, please fly home from Iowa. I'm going to pick you up at the airport. And then it's like, this is going to be really dangerous trying to pick you up from the airport because the internet's down and the subways aren't working and traffic's crazy and people are trying to steal my motorcycle and now they're trying to sexually harass you at the airport. That all to me kind of feels contrived, and it's like, that's not a big Jack storyline. It feels like Wilson just kind of pushed those things together to make it as though Jack is doing exciting action-oriented things, while the real important stuff is happening elsewhere with Reprisal, not even in New York City. And I know that sounds very like I'm disappointed with the pacing, but I don't know what else Wilson could do, right? I like this. I like the way it's working, but I'm saying in terms of if you were to think of it on a plot graph, right? Like if you've ever done this in English class, where you try to map out, you know, rising action, you know, climax, falling action, denouement, that whole thing, that this is definitely rising action, but maybe there's a little bit of a dip as we get towards the climax, right? That things are just kind of a little bit on pause with Jack, but you know that it's all leading to something. Okay. Two other notes. On page 379, you get this, like, Rasalom shows up in Drexler's office at the Septimus Order, and he's furious with Drexler because destroying the internet did not destroy the lady. And then he's just blaming Drexler for this. But it's like, Rasalom, shouldn't you know? Why would Drexler know better than you what will destroy the lady? Anyway, so he's furious at Drexler for this, and he looks at him, and I just love this description, where Ernst vaulted from his chair with a yelp of shock, whirled to find the one standing on the far side of his desk, his expression grim, his eyes ebon eternities of fury. Fear deeper than Ernst had never known glued his tongue to the roof of his mouth. But his eyes ebon eternities of fury. I just thought, boy, that is a great description. That is a great line. And it flows really well. It's not even like you're reading it and it's just so like, ooh, that doesn't feel like the rest of the prose. Wilson works it in so well. So this is what I'm saying is that in terms of pacing, that I'm going, it's not the most exciting Jack novel, especially the last 200 pages. It's not a typical Jack book, but doesn't mean that it's bad. It's still really interesting, and you get lines like that are so fun to read. They're so satisfying. Okay, my last note, and this is, I just have a note on the page on 307. This is Jack and Abe as they're talking about the fact that the internet is going to go down, and that civilization what will happen once, you know, the status quo is upended. And basically, you have two different worldviews. You've got kind of a Hobbes versus Locke worldview of man in the state of nature, right? That without civilization, without law and order, what will happen to society? Because Hobbes and Locke, they were political philosophers who both considered the question of man in the state of nature, and it's kind of just this, not a historical era, but more of a philosophical or theoretical period of time before we had a collective contract together as a society, like that human beings basically agreed we will form civilization, we will form society, and in doing so, we'll establish law and order, and it won't be complete the state of nature. Now, the question of it won't be what is it depends on whether you are, you know, more of a Hobbes person or more of a Locke person. Because if you're more of a Hobbes person, then you're like, it's anarchy, it's craziness, it's like The Walking Dead. It's just it's a nightmare world where people are just, you know, will go with every violent, selfish impulse that they have without restraint. Whereas Jack, and that's basically Abe's attitude, Jack has the attitude of, no, people are generally good, and there's not that many actually bad people in the world. And Wilson does a good job of explaining it. He says, this is Jack and Abe. Jack and he had had long discussions about civilization. Abe thought it was a veneer easily stripped away. Jack disagreed, believing that there were lots of civilized people about. Trouble was, those folks had no clue how to handle the wolves among them. And now, like, that's totally up to you what your worldview is, but that's Jack's worldview, that the world is filled with good people, but they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable to the few wolves that exist out there. Abe is like, no, this whole thing could collapse at any moment, and there's way more bad people in the world than you think. And the only reason why people are behaving as well as they are is because of the justice system, because they're afraid of consequences from, you know, the police, the court system, prison system, all of that stuff. That's the reason why people are behaving well. Jack has got the attitude of, no, people behave well whether the justice system is in full effect or not, because most people are good people, and there's only a few who would exploit them. It's been a discussion for, certainly in the Western world, we're talking kind of like the Enlightenment forward, hundreds of years, there's been this discussion of man and the state of nature and how much civilizing do we need in order to maintain a healthy society and a peaceful society. You know, what should be the role of the police and the judicial system and the justice system in general, all of that stuff. And you know, there's obviously, I mean, like, and this is kind of the first time I've made any real like cultural references beyond like outside of the books, but I mean, even with what's happening presently as I'm recording this, with questions of police brutality, right, and all of the protests that have been going on in the midst of George Floyd, his death, about defunding the police, and maybe we don't need a police presence because we need more social workers than police officers on the streets and things like that. And then other people are like, no, we need to give more funding to the police. And that all comes down to this kind of attitude that you have between Jack and Abe, and how much of like your worldview is so dependent on that, and that does inform policy. So there's a lot in the Repairman Jack series about libertarianism, and Jack in many ways is living out a libertarian fantasy of living outside of the system entirely, and Jack is able to do that. Jack is able to still be a good force in society. He's still able to be a good member of his community without paying taxes, without having a social security number, without having an official driver's license. He still follows the law, like the traffic laws, for the most part, you know, unless he's doing some kind of greater good, and then he will break traffic laws. He gives back to his community. He does his annual parkathon fundraiser to steal from, you know, criminals in Central Park, and then Jack does give back in a way, almost like taxes, but he's giving back to the greater good. That Jack can exist in this world, and he can still be a good contributing member of society without anyone forcing him to do it. That he's basically paying taxes, and he's essentially being charitable without any, you know, compulsion other than just his own good nature. So Jack believes that there's a lot of people who could be like him, that a lot of people would continue to do good even if there were no other reasons to do good than just people inherently are good. Abe does not have this attitude at all. And I think it's something that you should consider as you read through the books, because they both in a way are exploring libertarianism, right? That Abe believes that the government is completely incompetent and that ultimately people are bad, and that's why he wants to have weapons, and that's why he wants to have a backup plan. So Abe, in that libertarian concept, it has got the idea of the government is incompetent, and therefore you need to take care of yourself, right? You need to be a libertarian in terms of your own thinking, in terms of your own preparation. Jack is more of the libertarian thought of the government is unnecessary, perhaps incompetent, but even if it's not incompetent, it's unnecessary. We don't need as much government as we have because it's compelling people to do things that they would do anyway. We don't need as many police because people are generally good and won't exploit their neighbors. Either way, it seems to be this call to, we need less government, right? Which is I don't think I'm you know, blowing anybody's minds by saying that's what a huge amount of this series is about, is that the government is either incompetent or unnecessary, and both of those are fundamental suppositions of the libertarian ideology. So we have both of them kind of coming up there in that short little paragraph, but it does reflect the worldviews that they've had all along. And you have had discussions of this before between the two of them. So it's interesting to get that. And that's what I'm saying. In the last 200 pages, there's not a lot of action, but there's still a lot of interesting stuff that's going on. And it really does work towards, you know, where we know this thing is going. But boy, do I wish I had made the decision earlier, because I'm just following my reading schedule of what I had already announced. But if you are kind of a little bit behind in the series, I mean, or if you're recommending this to somebody else, I really do think that you should read Reprisal at the same time as reading Fatal Error. That maybe like 200 pages into Fatal Error, you just go ahead and read Reprisal and then come back to it. Basically from the period where Glaken disappears and Rasalom disappears and they go down south, I would say that would probably be a good time to check out, read Reprisal, come back to Fatal Error. And this is as somebody who has not read Reprisal, but it just seems like that's what would make the most sense. And you probably should also read Secret Circles just before Fatal Error. Still don't know what to do with The Last Christmas, but then after that, definitely The Dark at the End. All right. Well, those are my thoughts on Fatal Error. Please feel free to comment below, like, share, you know, subscribe, all of that stuff. All right. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.